How does one of the most famous stories in history begin? Some stories begin with lightning, but this one started with ash. Stay with me, and you'll learn which story was born in the darkness. In 1815, the Earth changed forever. On a remote Indonesian island, a volcano named Mount Tambora erupted with a force so violent that it turned the skies to ash. The explosion was heard 1,200 miles away, one of the most powerful sounds in human history. In the eruption's wake, entire villages vanished. Roughly 100,000 lives were said to be lost on impact, but Tambora's fury didn't end there. Its smoke and dust climbed high into the atmosphere, drifting across the planet and swallowing the sun itself. The following year, summer never came. Instead of sunlight, Europe and North America faced fog, frost, and famine. Crops failed, livestock starved, and epidemics swept through shattered cities. For 3 years, the world was cast into what many called a living darkness. But in this darkness, some of Europe's greatest artists found their most haunting inspiration. One of them was a young woman named Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin. Mary was born into an intellectual household. Her mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, was a pioneering feminist writer. Her father, William Godwin, a radical philosopher. But Mary's own story was marked by loss. Her mother died shortly after she was born, and her relationship with her father grew strained. Even as a child, Mary had inherited her parents' literary spirit. By the time she was 14, she had already published poetry verses to a comic piece called Maun Seer Nong Tong Pa, a humorous children's tale. 2 years later, when she was 16, Mary ran away with a married poet named Percy Bysshe Shelley, a man whose revolutionary ideals mirrored her father's, but whose love scandalized society. For eloping, Mary was disowned. Together with her stepsister, Claire Clairmont, Mary and Percy fled England and set off across Europe, wandering through war-scarred France and into Switzerland on what could be considered a kind of living romance. A 6-week tour of freedom, books, and forbidden love, funded by his shaky allowance and money he borrowed while creditors and family disapproved of the married poet who had run off with the 16-year-old Mary. They stayed in modest inns and rented small rooms in noisy boarding houses, often counting their coins and writing in shared journals at cramped tables. Unlike Mary, Claire had her own obsession, one that would pull them both into a strange chain of events. She was infatuated with another poet, a man both famous and infamous, Lord Byron. Byron was a literary sensation across Europe, celebrated for his passionate poetry and dark romanticism, but even more so for his scandalous personal life. He was a man whispered about in drawing rooms and condemned in newspapers. Charming, volatile, and surrounded by rumors of forbidden love, duels, and debts. To his admirers, he was a genius. To his critics, a devil in verse. In 1816, Claire learned that Lord Byron fled England to Europe amid rumors of debt, affairs, and scandal. One scandal, even including whispers of an affair with his half-sister, was traveling to Switzerland. Desperate to see him, Claire convinced Mary and Percy to follow. Mary, now traveling with Percy and their infant son, agreed. What awaited them beside Lake Geneva would become one of the most legendary gatherings in literary history. Not long after their arrival, Lord Byron, too, appeared on the lakefront, clearly unaware that the obsessed Claire had planned to surprise him. Despite their messy entanglements, Byron and Percy quickly discovered they admired each other's work. The two poets became fast friends and decided to rent neighboring villas by the lakeside. Byron took up residence in a grand mansion known as Villa Diodati, a stately, centuries-old home perched above Lake Geneva. It was an ideal place for poets and dreamers, spacious, candlelit, its balconies overlooking stormy water. Byron also brought with him his personal physician, Dr. John Polidori, a curious and brooding man fascinated by medicine and death. The weather, however, was dreadful. The lingering effects of Mount Tambora's eruption had transformed the summer skies into a constant gray. Rain, fog, and thunder rolled day after day. Confined indoors for nearly a week, the group spent their time reciting poetry, debating philosophy, and discussing strange new ideas. One topic in particular fascinated them, called galvanism, which was the scientific experiments that used electricity to jolt dead tissue into motion. Is life itself just energy? By the third day of being confined in the villa, tension was high and tempers began to fray. Byron grew irritated by Claire's attempts to win his affection, while Polidori became disturbingly infatuated with Mary, making advances she resisted fiercely. Percy, weighed down by guilt and depression, grew distant. Storms howled outside as they sat around flickering candles, trapped in a restless silence. Then one night, Byron made a proposal, a challenge for the friends. He asked each of them to write a ghost story, but not just any ghost story, one that was better than any of the stories they had just read, one that would rival the ones they'd been reading aloud from a German anthology of horror tales. Mary wanted to join in, but for days she found herself uninspired. Each morning, she later wrote, I was asked whether I had begun my story, and each morning I was forced to reply with a mortifying negative. Then, one sleepless night, something happened. As thunder cracked over the lake and lightning illuminated the room, Mary experienced what she would later describe as a vision. In her mind, she saw in her words, the hideous phantasm of a man stretched out, and then, on the working of some powerful engine, show signs of life. The idea lodged deep within her, and by morning, she had her story. When the group read their creations aloud, Byron declared Percy the winner, dismissing Mary's draft as too philosophical. Yet Percy encouraged her to finish it. She did, and 2 years later, in 1818, Frankenstein was published. The story of a scientist who brings life to the lifeless and suffers the consequences of his ambition. By then, death had already marked Mary's life. Her mother had died days after her birth, and in 1815, her first baby had died shortly after being born. A loss so profound, she wrote in her journal of a dream where the child came to life again, that it had only been cold, and that we rubbed it before the fire, and it lived. Those private hauntings echo in Frankenstein's obsession with reanimating the dead. Years later, reflecting on the strange power of the story she created in that dark summer, Mary would famously call the book her hideous progeny, and send it out into the world to go forth and prosper. But this was not the only story that became published after the competition. Another participant in the contest, Dr. Polidori, also turned his tale into something new. The Vampire, published in 1819, based on an idea by Byron. That story would become the foundation of modern vampire fiction. Though the creative spark of that stormy summer gave birth to literary immortality, tragedy followed its creators. Dr. Polidori took his own life in 1821. Percy Shelley drowned in a storm the following year at just 29. Byron's daughter with Claire, little Allegra, died in a convent in 1822. And Byron himself succumbed to fever in 1824. Only Mary and Claire lived beyond age 50. Yet the story Mary birthed in the dark, her hideous progeny, as she calls it, still walks among us. Frankenstein became one of the most influential works in history, echoing through every tale that dares to ask what happens when humans overstep nature's bounds. Perhaps that's the question Mary left us with. If we can create life, where then does the soul belong? And if we can shape life from death, what responsibility do we carry for what we've made? If you've stayed with me this long, thank you for watching. If you enjoy curious stories like this, consider subscribing. Until next time, this is your host, Lady Reverie, keeper of the Midnight Archive. Good night.